Welcome back, everyone, to Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. Tonight, we're talking about melodies from the Mekong. My name is Philip Nguyen. I'm one of your co-hosts, and I'm here along with Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is the author of The Sympathizer and its sequel, The Committed. So welcome back, Viet, to another episode of Accented.
Philip, it's so good to be with you, and it's so great to be here with our guest, Dr. Alexander Cannon. He's an associate professor in the Department of Music at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He holds undergraduate degrees in economics and music from Pomona College and an MA and PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of Michigan. He studies traditional and popular musics of Southern Vietnam and of the Vietnamese diasporas, and has publications in Asian music, ethnomusicology, Ethnomusicology Forum, and the Journal of Vietnamese Studies. His recent book, Seeding the Tradition, Musical Creativity in Southern Vietnam from Wesleyan University Press, this past year explores creativity in Southern Vietnamese music practice. And that book was recently awarded the American American Musicological Society's AMS 75 Publication Award for Younger Scholars. Dr. Alex Cannon, welcome to Accented. So good to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Hey, it's a very impressive list of credentials that you have. And of course, even the name of your field, ethnomusicology, is incredibly intimidating because I'm not sure I understand ethno and musicology put together. So maybe for the sake of the audience, you might have to explain what ethnomusicology is. Hey, you know what? That was my fault, and I hung up on it just for this episode. All right. Hey, Dr. Alex Cannon, tell us about your musical journey. How did you get involved with ethnomusicology, and what is that? And what drew you to Vietnamese traditional music?
Of course. So let me start off by talking a bit about what ethnomusicology is. Ethnomusicology is the study of music in its sociocultural context. And so what ethnomusicologists try to do is understand why people make music, how they go about making music, and the role and purpose of music in a particular location of the world. And, I came to ethnomusicology as an undergraduate. I started off actually as a flute performance major. And so I had sort of grand dreams of becoming sort of the next, concert virtuoso up on the Carnegie Hall stage. I learned very quickly I wasn't talented enough to be able to do that, and so I was, trying to explore new sounds in the world, or really sounds that were new to me. And so I took a class in the music of Southeast Asia that was offered at my undergraduate institution, and I got, introduced to the music of the Philippines, the music of Thailand, the music of Burma, and when we came to Vietnam, this music was incredibly rich to me. And I still remember my favorite piece of music from that class. It was called Ma'avu, which is a piece of Nhạc Nhạc Cung Đình Huế, or the court music of central Vietnam. And the reason I like this piece of music so much, Ma'avu, is because it was about dancing horses. And you get 3 or 4 gan, which are these oboe-like instruments that are really, really loud. And they're all playing at the same time, and they're depicting sort of the movement of a horse. And to me, I thought to myself, well, this is supposed to be court music. Isn't court music supposed to be kind of stoic and, really strict and really regimented? But this wasn't at all. It was dynamic. It was exciting. It was danceable, even. And so, I started this journey of trying to explore what Vietnamese music was. And at the time, so this is in kind of the mid 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, there were recordings out there, and a lot of these recordings were made in the United States. They were made by people like Nguyen Thuy Pham, who lived in Ohio at the time, and he had a small ensemble, and he was just pumping out these recordings and distributing them all around the United States and elsewhere in the world in order to try to generate interest in traditional Vietnamese music. And so I remember going to the library and doing a huge interlibrary loan order, just trying to get every single recording that I could find. and then just listening to these pieces of music, folk songs from northern Vietnam, chamber music from southern Vietnam, and it was all gorgeous and really, really rich. And so I decided at that point that I really wanted to explore more of this, and I went on to do my my MA and PhD in this field.
That is awesome, Alex. I'm not sure if you quite remember, but we had done an event together for the Center for World Music, also with Vân-Ánh, who we've had on the Accented show before. And I remember, I think either leading up to that event or following the event, you were your book was not yet published, and I know you were having this conversation, this dialogue about whether to name it music of in Southern Vietnam, or in musical creativity in Southern Vietnam or in South Vietnam. And I was wondering, how did you get to that point where you landed on musical creativity in Southern Vietnam, and sort of the scope of the work that you have done research for and write about in your book?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, this sort of distinction between South Vietnam and Southern Vietnam, I mean, the reason I picked Southern Vietnam is because in many ways it's more inclusive, and it kind of goes beyond just this geographical boundary of the Mekong Delta, and even sort of, goes all over the world. I mean, there are people with Southern Vietnamese identities who live all over the world, and in the book, I look at a kind of music called Đơn Ca Tài Tử, which is usually translated as the music of talented amateurs or music for diversion. And this music is played by individuals all over the world. Yes, it has its origins in what's now sort of geographically Southern Vietnam in the Mekong Delta. But if you go on YouTube, there are thousands of videos of people in their garages or sort of out in the middle of a field playing this music and recording themselves. You can go on Facebook now and kind of follow these musicians who just generate copious amounts of Đơn Ca Tài Tử for the world to hear. And so this music is not limited to, Cần Thơ or Rắc Giá or Cà Mau in Southern Vietnam. It's played in Westminster. It's played in Quebec. It's played in Paris. It's played in Taiwan. I mean, this music is generated by people all over the world who have some connection to Southern Vietnam.
Okay, so I have heard that besides being an ethnomusicologist, that's being a scholar, you also actually play some of these instruments?
I do, yeah. So I play Đơn Ca Tài Tử. I've been known to get together with friends and play Vòng Cổ or Nhạc Cụ Hoài Lang. I'm not nearly as accomplished as someone like Vân-Ánh, but I can kind of throw a tune together in order to kind of generate camaraderie.
Okay. I have to interrupt. First of all, for the sake of our audience, could you repeat the name of that? Honestly, for the sake of me, could you repeat the name of that instrument and explain what it is? And just to be honest, do you like drink alcohol and, do the whole Vietnamese, thing of hanging out when you play these instruments, or is it just purely just like the beauty of the music itself?
I think he wants to know if you nyao.
I know. I mean, I would love to be able to say that it's just the beauty of the music. And there actually is something to that. I mean, there is something in this music modally, the way that these tunes are constructed, that actually is profoundly moving and does generate an ecstatic experience. It's called Swatthan. It's this, you sort of, your spirit is moved through the music. Oftentimes that spirit needs a little bit of encouragement through drinking beer. So yeah, like I do get together and we drink with my friends and then play this music. So the instrument.
What is the instrument again?
So the instrument that I play is I play the Dan Chain, which is the 16 or 17 string zither. I also play an instrument called the Dan Sen, which is a 2 or 3 stringed lute. Oftentimes it's translated as the plum blossom flower lute. And you can play really, really fast on the instrument. You can also play really, really slow and really beautifully. And yeah, like I get together and I grab one of these instruments, or it's kind of, put right in front of me, and I'm told, Alex, play. And I go ahead and I play, and we generate music together.
Awesome.
So Alex, I know that you're currently calling in from the UK, if I'm not mistaken, and you've lived and worked in the US, and I'm sure that you've also done plenty of research in Vietnam. How would could you talk a little bit about that experience, learning about traditional Vietnamese music in each of these different places? How the music scene changes or shifts in each of the geographical places?
Yeah, sure. So I've done most of my research in southern Vietnam, in Saigon and Can Tho, but then I've also done some research in the U.S. as well, in both sort of northern and southern California, and there are a number of differences between the two locations. In terms of traditional music practice in the U.S., there's this real emphasis on playing to preserve. In order to, ensure that the sort of Vietnamese and Vietnamese American identity continues through song, and that these tunes are passed to the next generation. And there are a couple of musicians working in the United States, and Nguyen Châu in southern Vietnam, in Southern California, with his Lac Home group. They spend a lot of time kind of playing music for a younger generation and teaching this music for a younger generation. And I think one of the reasons why this is done is because Vietnamese living in diaspora work tremendously hard to generate an archive of sounds that can ground and root their identities, particularly following the exodus from Vietnam. And so when you move to a new location, you need to find something to ground and to root you. And many people have used music in order to be able to do this. In Vietnam today, yes, this music is used to kind of preserve a Vietnamese identity. It is being taught to the next generation, but there isn't as much of this emphasis on kind of building a sense of rootedness or groundedness. I will say too, though, that there's a great deal of diversity in Vietnam today concerning musical practice. In Saigon, traditional music is not found as much. It's more difficult to find a teacher, although there are places where you can study this music. But when you go out onto the street today, you don't hear a lot of traditional music. You hear some traditional music mixed with popular music, but you don't hear the kind of more traditional, more quote unquote authentic traditional music in the city. When you get out into the Mekong Delta, though, it's everywhere. You hear it on the street at night. You hear musicians playing in their homes. I remember one instance where I was volunteering at a school, an English language school in Can Tho, and I started telling students about my research, and the whole class just erupted in a rendition of Vòng Cổ, Nostalgia for the Past, this really, really well-known tune from the South, and amazed me that every kid in the classroom knew this and knew how to sing it. Whereas you don't find that as much in the big city.
No, I've spent time in Saigon and Hanoi, and I think you're definitely right. I barely ever heard any traditional music. You'd have to go out of your way to a particular venue in order to do that. But if you're in any kind of a bar or a cafe, it'd all be like contemporary pop music and that kind of thing. And that's, I would see concerts and all of that, and I would go to the tea houses, and it would all be it'll all be pop music. So I think maybe we have lost something there. And of course, you're an ethnomusicologist and you've published your first book. Congratulations. I'm also an academic in one part of my life. I know how hard it is to write an academic book and get it published. It is Seeding the Tradition, Musical Creativity in Southern Vietnam, out this year from Wesleyan University Press. Tell us about this book, Dr. Alex.
So the book has two foci. One is on Đơn Ca Tài Tử and writing something of a history of Đơn Ca Tài Tử, so people can understand the richness of this genre of music. But the other aspect of this book is on musical creativity and what musical creativity is. And I argue in the book that in sort of spaces of Southern Vietnamese music practice today, this is both in Vietnam and elsewhere, there's a kind of clash of creativity models. There's a one model is this kind of long-standing kind of Taoist creativity model, whereby musicians sort of spontaneously produce music. It's drawn from their own everyday lives. They get together and they play with others. They improvise together. And there's this real kind of social focus on making music. And that's starting to clash with a kind of a Euro-American musical creativity model. So I think we all kind of know what this creativity model is out of the West. It's, you know, you usually think of like the struggling artist working by themselves. You might think of Viet sort of sitting in a room with a candle, sort of working on the sympathizer. Sort of, it's this kind of the struggling artist trying to produce something that comes out of them, and then at the end they're lauded for their individual work. Whereas these other creativity models that are long-standing in Vietnam focus more on the social dynamic that generates that kind of work of art. And so musicians today are really kind of caught between these individual creativity models, like what I produce is the product of blood, sweat, and tears of my own struggle, and this other model of like, well, we're all kind of struggling together, we're all working together, and what we produce belongs to all of us. Now, that struggle isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's actually quite dynamic. You know, musicians who fall into both camps, they kind of spur each other on. And so that sort of struggle is really maintaining the tradition as musicians sort of figure out, what is this music that we play today? And how can we keep it dynamic for future generations?
Thank you for that, Dr. Alex. And for everyone here with us in the audience and those who are joining us, my name is Philip Nguyen. I'm one of the co-hosts for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, along with Viet Thanh Nguyen, and we're in conversation with Dr. Alexander Cannon. And we're talking about his book, Seeding the Tradition, Musical Creativity in Southern Vietnam, which has been published and is, I think, your first published book, right, Alex? So on the cover, there is what looks to be an elderly man with what looks to be a zither or a danchan. Alex, could you speak a little bit more about why you chose this image, this person, as the cover of your first book?
Yes, absolutely. So this is Nguyen Vinh Bao, the late Nguyen Vinh Bao, who he passed away a couple of years ago at 104. He is a major musician of Vietnamese music. He's also well known as a luthier, or as a maker of dan chain. So that zither that you see on the front. And he was an extraordinary musician, and he taught me a great deal about how to not only play music, but also how to think about music and the role that music can play in our everyday lives. He used to tell me quite frequently that he saw music as a friend, something or something that he could converse with and that he could talk to. And so, you know, when he was feeling particularly low or particularly unhappy, he would take his zither and he would sit in his studio by himself and just play music. And he would think of this as a conversation that he was having with this kind of corpus of knowledge. And he would think about the past. He would think about a problem that he was, facing at that particular moment. And he would just converse using his knowledge, using sound. And after an hour or two, he would kind of come out of his funk and be like, okay, like I've spoken to my friend, I feel better now, now I can go to sleep or get on with my day. And so he really taught me a great deal about how music can be used in order to alleviate pain and alleviate the struggles that we face in our everyday lives.
Now, Dr. Alex, you've picked a musical selection for us to hear. Is that right?
I did, yeah. So the clip that I picked is a rao, or an improvised prelude that was played by Nguyen Vinh Bao. And the reason I picked this one is because it shows how he makes traditional music conversant with contemporary life. So he recorded this in his small home in Saigon in Binh Thanh district. And at the time, there was a lot of construction going on around him, and it was impossible to get away from that construction. I mean, anyone who's been to Saigon recently sort of knows this. And so as there's someone hammering away at the construction site next door, he's like, I'm going to improvise and I'm going to converse with this hammer. I'm going to bring it into into my sphere. I'm going to pick out the pitch of that hammer and I'm going to talk to it. And so he actually uses traditional music he uses the sounds of kind of this construction site to sort of strengthen the tradition.
All right, and we are so fortunate to have our resident DJ Puzzle here to play us. That was amazing. Thanks for sharing that. And thanks to DJ Puzzle and thanks to Dr. Alex for picking that song. Hey, our previous episode of this show, Accented, with the theme of melodies from the Mekong, had an incredible musician and composer on, who is Vân-Ánh, Vanessa Vaugh. And I understand that you are one of her collaborators. Could you tell us a little bit about what you two are doing together?
Yeah, sure. So Chị Vân-Ánh and I are working on her Mekong projects. These projects bring the sounds and the people of the Mekong Delta region to audiences in the United States. And so what we've been doing is kind of working on what sounds we can incorporate into these productions and what stories we can tell. I mean, all music has a story behind it. And so we are kind of putting together these narratives in order to be able to tell the stories of the beauty of the Mekong Delta and of the Mekong River, but also the struggles that people are facing today in the region.
And Alex, for folks who may be looking to find traditional music, any recommendations or names that you'd like to drop for our audience or our listeners?
Yes, so look for recordings by Nguyen Thuy Pham. They're still available. You can still sometimes find some of them on Spotify. There's a really cool traditional musician who's based in Sweden. Her name is Nguyen Thanh Thuy. She's a zitherist, and her works are beautiful. And she's now kind of expanding out. She's starting to incorporate electronics into her music. So you can, sort of listen to the way that tradition is starting to kind of blend and incorporate the more contemporary as well. If you're more interested in composed music that incorporates tradition, I would encourage people to check out the work of Professor P.Q. Fan, who's based at Indiana University. His work is phenomenal. He incorporates all different kinds of traditional musics into his works, and he really encourages his artists who are, kind of Western classical music artists. He encourages them to try to understand what Vietnamese traditional music is so they can properly play the music that he composes. So he really gets his artists to work hard to understand tradition.
Dr. Alex, what we've heard from you and also in the song that we heard as well is so intensely personal, soulful. And yet at the same time, with traditional Vietnamese music, classical Vietnamese music, it's not something that's really well known outside of Vietnam, not even that well known outside of the Vietnamese speaking part of the Vietnamese diaspora. It seems like such a personal form of music. How do you think it's used for personal expression today, especially in the contemporary moment, both in Vietnam and in the diaspora?
So, when one learns traditional music, just by learning songs, one starts to learn the vocabulary of the sort of the vast vocabulary, musical vocabulary of how you put together tunes and how you make them meaningful. So one of the things I talk about in my book are the different deo, or different modes of Vietnamese musical practice. Some deo are quite happy, and you can play happy songs with them. Other deo are quite sad. And so that element of personal kind of expression comes from, selecting how you want to express yourself sonically, modally, through sound. Nguyen Vinh Bao, when he was teaching me how to play music, he said, yes, you can play happy tunes and you can play sad tunes, and you can also play like really, really sad tunes. And he said, there's this one particular mode. He said it means something like this. Imagine that you're dead and you've just been put into the grave, and you want to sort of stand up and say one last thing, but you can't because you're dead. That's how sad this music is. And if you know how to play it properly, you can evoke those really, really sad feelings. You don't have to use words. And that's the beauty of musical expression. You don't have to try to talk this out. You just use the sounds that you understand, and people will know what you mean.
Oh my goodness. I feel like I was teleported into my future grave and thinking about it, and I got into this really deep zone. So I think that's quite profound, especially as as I listen to my my dad and the uncles like sing out their karaoke music. There's also this sense of like grief and nostalgia that comes out, I think, in a similar but not quite as deep of a way. So thank you for sharing that with us, Alex. And our last question for you for tonight is, what's next for you? Where can we find you? What are you working on? All of the above.
So I'm working on a couple of different projects right now. One of which involves looking at sort of the vast archive of materials at UC Irvine in their Southeast Asian archive about the Vietnamese American experience, sort of starting in 1975 and going forward. There are really tremendous materials there about how Vietnamese Americans tried to make and remake their lives in the United States. And there are a lot of stories to be told, not just about music, although I am focusing on music. And so I'm trying to understand what musicians were doing, how, where music was being performed. Many, many cultural nights were organized organized from the late 70s onwards. And I kind of want to learn who was at these cultural nights and what they were doing, what they were playing, and how they were generating a sense of community. One of the other projects I'm working on in a slightly different vein is looking at a kind of music and cultural policy of the Republic of Vietnam, of South Vietnam. And I'm really interested in the written work of someone named Nguyen Dang Thop, who was really interested in kind of creating cultural connections between South Vietnam and other parts of Asia. He writes about Tibet, he writes about India, he even writes about the Congo and the kind of decolonial experience in the Congo. And in order to try to say, like, you know, what kind of culture can we make together that kind of falls outside of American influence, that falls, you know, outside of sort of Chinese and Soviet influence, and how do we make something unique? And he spent years and years writing about this in Saigon, and so I'm really getting into it to try to understand his mindset and the culture that he was trying to make in that period.
Well, that is so cool, especially as someone who attended a lot of Vietnamese culture nights as a college student in the 80s and 90s. I'm really looking forward to at least that part of your research, Dr. Alex. Hey, I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen with my co-host Philip Nguyen of the show Accented, put on by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. The show that we've been producing is Melodies from the Mekong with our special guest, Dr. Alexander Cannon, author of Seeding the Tradition, this book on Vietnamese music. We've been having this great conversation with Dr. Alex about his research and about the complexities and the beauties of Vietnamese music. Thank you so much, Dr. Alex. I'm going to turn it over to DJ Puzzle to take us out of another episode.